In this video, we'll be replacing the rear wheel hub in this 2005 Honda Element. We're going to remove the rear wheel. It's going to be a 19 millimeter. Go ahead and take off the lug nuts now. So we're going to remove our caliper and caliper bracket. It's going to be 14 millimeters. We'll start here. And we'll keep an eye on this inside nut. If this inside nut spins, then we're going to have to use a wrench in here to stop it. So far, so good. We'll move up top. So our brake hose here is really tight going to our caliper. So instead of stressing that brake hose and trying to stretch it, we're just going to take this bolt out here, which will give us a little more room to remove our caliper. And then this bolt is a 12 millimeter. And what we're going to do here is take this bolt out, take this bracket with the brake hose away, and put our bolt right back in so we don't lose it. Just a few threads. And now we have more room to remove our caliper. So now what we're going to do is take our caliper, slide it off of our pads. And for right now, we will end up moving it again, but for right now, I'm going to rest it right there on the lower arm. We can take off our brake pads. And then we'll move into our caliper bracket. Going to be two bolts. They're going to be 14 millimeter. Now we'll just have to move this a little bit more. And your caliper bracket should come right out. Now moving to our rotor, you can see we have one Phillips screw. You should have two Phillips screws. If you do have two Phillips screws, go ahead and remove them both. We only have one, so we'll be doing this one. Now once your Phillips screw is removed, you should be able to give your rotor a little tap and work it straight off. So what we're going to need to do now is take off this axle nut, but you can see it's been staked into the axle. So we're going to have to bend that back out so we can spin the nut out. I'm going to start here with a punch. We may move to a flathead screwdriver just to straighten it out. Now the goal here is just to be able to spin the nut out, not to recreate and make this round. You should be replacing this nut. You don't want to restake that, as it'll probably break. So now that we have this opened up enough, let's get a socket and back out that nut. So now with a 32mm socket, we'll take off the axle nut. So now we're going to push our axle back as much as we can. You can try and use a hammer right here, as long as you're hitting it flat. That's okay. If that doesn't work for you, try and get a punch in that center. Push back. Now our vehicle is a four-wheel drive, so we have a full axle, which means that this is going to stay here. It's not going to come out the back in a small piece. All right, so the goal here was just to loosen that up. And then we'll go ahead and pull our hub. So now that we have our puller in place, mounted to a few studs, we're going to try and pull out our hub. So we're going to need to remove our speed sensor. It is actually into the bearing itself, so this is going to need to come out. It's going to be a 10mm. Yep. And ours just broke. So our bolt on our speed sensor broke, which doesn't look good for the rest of the sensor. What you would want to do is slowly wiggle your sensor out using a little rust penetrant, a little patience. So we went ahead and did that, and it turns out that this plate broke, which means the rest of our speed sensor is stuck in here. So for us, we're going to have to replace the speed sensor cable. So we're going to unplug our cable. We're going to end up cutting it here and drilling it out and move forward. So we're going to loosen these two bolts down the bottom here, holding our knuckle in. We also have one at the top. We'll focus down here first. This inside head here is going to be a 14mm, and the nut, there's two nuts actually back here. The outside one is going to be the first to come off, and that's going to be a 17. So this inside nut here, you can see it's a little loose, which means it's not threaded on. All right? So what we're going to do now, try and tap back our bolt that runs right through here. So that loosened up this nut for us to come all the way off. And you can see it's not perfectly round, so it is keyed to this bolt here. So we're going to leave this just the way it is for now, because all we're going to need to do is swing the knuckle down. We don't need to fully take the knuckle off. We may decide to do that, but we're going to start with the knuckle just swung down, so this is fine. We'll do the same thing here. So now our front bolt is going to be a 17 millimeter on the inside, a 17 millimeter on the front side. So again, the goal here is just to loosen these up enough to swing the knuckle down. So we'll stop here. If that allows us to swing it down, we're good. If not, we'll loosen these up a little more. And now our top bolt is going to be a 17 on the front and an 18 on the back on the nut here. Now the top bolt we have to remove completely. At this point, be ready for your suspension to shift slightly when you pull this bolt out. There's your bolt. I'm going to take this top arm and just lift it up a little bit out of the way. And now we can take our knuckle and parking brake assembly, and we're going to try and roll this forward or out. I'm going to make sure our axle stays in. And the goal here is to get the axle out of the knuckle. Now you have your parking brake cable, which is still attached through your backing plate. Just make sure you're keeping an eye on that. You don't want to overstress and break that. So we're going to pull forward, and we're going to pull forward on our knuckle and pull inwards on our axle. And the goal, like I said, is to get the axle out of the knuckle. All right, once the axle's out of the knuckle, I'm going to put it up and out of the way on the rear sway bar. We can now push our knuckle upwards just a little bit. So we've set up our hub in our presser, and this is one option to do it while it's in the vehicle. All right, so we have a plate on the back up against our bearing and a plate in front pulling in our hub. You want to make sure your hub is really flat to your bearing surface here. You want to pull it in very flat, very even. There's a break in the bearings, there's a gap in the bearings. You don't want to send this into that, or you'll pop the bearing into pieces. Now that we have it set up, we'll go ahead and tighten it down and start to pull our hub in. So we had to swap the tool around to get the 24 millimeter of our tool on this side. So we'll just continue now to pull in the rest of our hub all the way. And once it's bottomed out and your hub is all the way in, go ahead and back out your tool if you're using this method. So this is how we were set up in the vehicle. Plate on the back side holding the bearing together, plate on the front pulling the hub in. So on the inside here you can see that your hub is fully seated all the way into the bearing, and the bearing is still flat and even and not separated. That's what you want to see. So now before we put our axle back in, we'll just put a very light coat of grease on the splines. Now we're going to take our axle and line it up with our hub. Now the goal here is to bring our hub up to the axle and get our splines to interlock before we try and push the two together. Otherwise, they're not going to go together. So we're going to push the hub up and then angle our axle into it. Now once you get them close, what you can do is spin your hub to get your splines to align on the axle. So now we have our knuckle almost back into position. And you can tell because if we pull our top arm down, we're just about there. We're going to push our knuckle backwards till it meets up with our top arm. And what I'm going to do here is use this 3/8 extension just to hold it. So now on the inside, looking at the rear wheel axle, we have a little bit left to go to push the splines into the hub. So we're going to get a little creative here. Gently tap that axle in. Once we get a couple of threads to poke through here, we're going to use the axle nut to pull it the rest of the way. So we're going to use a soft mallet on the inside where we can to try and drive that axle forward. So now that we've got our axle to pop through here just enough, what we're going to do is put our axle nut on. This isn't going to be final. When we do our axle nut final, we're going to need to put a little engine oil right here. All we're going to do now is pull our axle as far forward as we can. So we'll thread it on a couple of threads and tighten it down. All right, now we'll go ahead and loosen that up. Now you can see how far we pulled the axle in. So now we can just take our axle nut and loosely put it back on. Now from here, we can work on the top bolt and start to reassemble. So now up top, we have our 3/8 extension holding our top arm in place. So we're going to just follow that with a bolt. And thread on our nut. Now we're going to have to torque all three of these areas down with this suspension under load. So we're going to loosely put all the nuts and bolts back in here, then we're going to jack this up, torque it all down under load. So now down here on the bottom of our arm, we have our nut, which if you remember wasn't threaded on. It slides on and it clocks into position. And then on top of that, we do have our nut. So now what we're going to do to simulate load on the vehicle, because we're on a lift, we're going to use a pole jack. We're going to lift our rear suspension. If you weren't on a lift and you were working on the ground, this is when you would use a floor jack. What you want to do is lift your rear suspension on this side to mimic the load of the vehicle on the suspension. Okay, once you've done that, now we can start to torque down our 3 bolts on our knuckle. We're going to start here. Now this bolt here is going to be 43 foot-pounds. And the inside bolt here, or the front bolt, is going to be 42 foot-pounds. And now we can work up top. So now our top bolt on our top arm is going to be 69 foot-pounds. So now that we've torqued down our knuckle, we can lower our pole jack, or at this point you can lower your jack stand or your floor jack. So if you're working on a lift or a jack, what you want to do is torque your axle nut down to 134 foot-pounds. We're on a lift, so we're a little bit higher than usual, so we're going to use a long pry bar between the studs on the hub and pry or pivot it against the ground. This will stop our hub from spinning while we torque the axle nut down. So again, 134 foot-pounds. So now that we have our axle nut torqued, what we're going to do is spin our hub. So we have the axle here in this little cutout facing straight up and down. And the last step to our axle nut is to stake the nut into this cutout in the axle. It's a lot easier to do when it's straight up and down, so you're hammering straight down. We'll go ahead and do that now. So now we're going to use a punch onto the axle nut and stake that into place. So now what we're going to do is reinstall our speed sensor. And there's a notch that we're looking to align in the bearing. So now that you have your speed sensor pressed all the way down, you can go ahead and install our bolt. So right here we have our bracket for our brake hose. So we'll take that bolt out. We're going to take our caliper and we're going to feed it through underneath our speed sensor and upper arm. And again, if you didn't do this step, that's fine. You won't need to be moving your caliper around if you didn't do that. But what you will need to do is reattach now your bracket onto the knuckle. So we'll take our bolt and our brake hose bracket, So there is a little shoulder here that you're going to have to get on the back side of this bracket into position. And then this bolt is a 12 millimeter. Go ahead and tighten it down. So now from here, we're going to put our rotor on, and you'll notice we have 2 threaded screw holes on our hub. We're going to align the 2 countersunk screw holes here with those. You can see our rotor slides easily on. If for some reason your rotor doesn't slide over your parking brakes, you'll have to come down below here and adjust your wheel to bring your parking brakes in to get your rotor to clear. Once you have your rotor on, go ahead and replace your Phillips screws. We only have one for this vehicle. You would be replacing both or reinstalling both. Once you're done with that, we can move on to the caliper. So now we're going to take our caliper bracket, put it into position, and thread in our 2 bolts. We're going to snug these bolts up, and we'll come back and torque them down. We're going to torque these 2 caliper bracket bolts to 41 foot-pounds. Now we're going to reinstall our pads. We're going to put the wear indicator on the bottom inside. We're going to take our caliper and put it into position. Now because we're using the same pads, we're not replacing the pads, the fact that the piston is out slightly is okay, it should fit. But if you're replacing your pads, you're going to want to compress your piston to get over the new depth of your pads. So once your caliper is in place, we can thread in our 2 bolts. You'll notice on the caliper bracket where the pins are, you have these nuts here. If while you're threading in your 2 bolts, those spin, we'll have to back them up with a wrench. And we'll snug these up. Again, keeping an eye on this nut here. Looks good. All right, we'll come back and torque it down. We're going to torque our 2 caliper bolts to 16 foot-pounds. So when I do a wheel, I like to put on top and bottom lug nut, rock back and forth, continue to tighten them down. by hand. This just helps you get it nice and flat against the rotor. Give it a look. Looks good. So we're going to snug these up in a crisscross pattern. And then we'll lower it down, put the tire on the ground, and torque them down. So now that we've lowered the vehicle down, our tire's on the ground, we're going to go ahead and torque down our lug nuts to 79 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a crisscross pattern.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.